I'm not quite sure why I put this one up first. I was going to do a quick revision of contract law first, but I know that you want to know what the exam looks like and have a quick talk about the exam, so we'll do that first. And then I have a slide pack which I think is very endearingly called Around Contract Law in 40 Slides. And so we'll do a high-level revision using that. Spoiler alert, there are actually 42 slides. I failed. And then we have a quiz, a game, problems to solve, practice problems to do. So that's my plan for the day. You will interrupt me, ask me questions. I will either answer them or I won't. And this will be the last of our 12 weeks together. So let's get on with it. I want to start talking about the exam itself. As I've mentioned to a number of you, and there's a whole heap now of past exams for you to have a look at, but I've changed the format of the exam slightly. So don't get too sort of embedded in the exam structure, because I realised that because you can't use your pens when you're doing the reading time in the exams, I think it can be quite confusing having multiple fact scenarios. So all of the questions relate to the same fact scenario. Well, pretty much all of them. Well, let's just walk through this. So there are basically two parts. One tiny weeny part, one big fat juicy part. The first part is the critical analysis section. So that will be a question. They're different depending on whether you're OUA or whether you're face-to-face, which will ask you to share your opinion with me about some aspect of the coursework so far. I'll talk a little bit about what that might look like in a minute. The exam this time is going to be marked out of 60. It's only out of 60 because I just think 60 is less scary than 120. And it's only out of a number that's divisible by 60 because I just think it's easier for you to do the maths in your head. It's a 2-hour exam. If it's worth 15 marks, then it's going, and there are 60 points all up, that means you should spend about 30 minutes on that bit. And you should spend the rest of the time on the other bit. So, 1 mark equals roughly 2 minutes in my head. I think that's a really good rule of thumb to use. It's not an exact science, clearly, but by thinking about how many minutes it might take, mind you, they're going to be really busy minutes. I want you to be working really hard over the whole thing. But if you're thinking about it in proportion, if you're spending half an hour on something that's worth 3 points, that leaves you 3 minutes to do something that is worth 7 points, then chances are you've got that back to front. So the 45 marks is based on the problem question. So there's one scenario. Then there are a number of questions about that scenario. So in the past, when you look at the past exams, there's a couple of scenarios and each has sort of one fairly deep question. And one of my observations was, so all up that's 90 minutes worth of points, really. My observation was that with the scenarios, if somebody got off track early, they could end up doing really badly. Because if you were sort of answering the wrong question or you had got yourself mixed up with the facts in some way, it was very hard for me to find ways to give people marks. And so what I was thinking is by having one scenario and then smaller questions that relate to that scenario, the questions themselves will help you focus a bit, and hopefully I will see a higher quality of answer, and I'm giving you enough clues that you can give me a high quality answer too. So one problem scenario, but what will happen is you'll get your problem scenario, there'll be a couple of questions about the scenario, and then I might throw in a few extra facts or say, what if this wasn't true? Or something else happened, to add for you to build on that as you're doing the exam. So that in a nutshell is what it's going to look like. I was looking at it today and thinking, yeah, you guys are going to be writing like the clappers. There's a lot in it, which is good for me because it means that there's enough there for everybody should be able to answer all of the questions, absolutely, but there is enough there that there should be plenty of you who are able to stretch, and it should be easy for me to tell who really shines and who's on top of it, and well, hopefully there won't be anybody who isn't going to get across the line, but sometimes there is. We'll see how we go. I'm not worried about you guys though, actually. I think we're pretty on top of it here. So any questions about that? Concerns, frustrations? No, I can't give it to you in advance. No, I can't. I did actually have a go. I thought it would be quite good to give you the whole scenario in advance, like just give you the facts and then go with the questions from there, but I couldn't get the okay for it, which is a bit of a shame. But anyway, so you're going to have to think about exam technique, which for some of you won't have done exams for a very long time. Others of you will be really good at that. We'll see how we go. So, time is points. Just remember that. 1 point, roughly 2 minutes. Shouldn't be too hard. So I want to talk a little bit about how to answer exam questions. I usually tell this story about now. I don't know whether I should keep telling it or not, but is there anybody in the room who hasn't done an exam in the last 20 years? Okay. Not quite 20, the last 10 years or more? Last 5 years? Haven't done one? Yep. So there's a few of you who haven't done them for quite a while. There's probably a larger proportion in our OUA cohort because they tend to have come from life in the profession. I did my first exam this millennia in 2012. So, and when I say this millennia, it wasn't even the 90s when I did the one before that. In fact, it was pretty much the first half of the 80s, most likely. Oh no, probably 86, something like that. Oh no, 88. 88 would have been the last. Yeah, so Australia was 200 years since invasion, and I did an exam that same time. So I was doing my MBA, and very first lot of exams, and I did this kind of, fancy MBA at Melbourne Uni where they get a whole lot of senior executives and they basically lock you on campus for a month at a time. So you basically live in, there's 30 of you, it's this kind of elite, largely expensive program to get people who really don't have the time to study to do the study. And so on the day before you have exams, you basically take the paper and you take it back to your room to do it. And they turn off the Wi-Fi, you hand in your phones, you sign a document that says you're not going to cheat. They turn off the telephones and off you go and you do your exam. The night before, sitting with one of the guys in our, MBAs, they do stuff in cohorts, so call them a syndicate there. And so one of my syndicate partners, and he was completely freaking out, absolutely freaking out. And he's similar age to me, so around 50, and he's like, I haven't done an exam for a very long time. I was shit at them then. I can't see any reason why I'll be any better at them now. And I'm just like, just relax. We're all in the same boat, right? We went to the classes, we did the work, we know what we're doing, we will be fine. And so I'm sort of calming him down. I'm thinking, this is right. So wish I'd listened to what I said. He was fine. He was absolutely fine. Me, on the other hand, I went and picked up that exam. There was this tiny little thing I wasn't expecting that I thought I would be able to do something, and it turned out I thought I'd be able to type it basically, and I had to handwrite it. So stuff like that, make sure you know what to expect. And just the act of handwriting just completely freaked me out. So I've gone back to the room. I think it would have been better if I was in an exam hall because I couldn't have actually completely freaked out. I had a complete panic attack. I was literally at one stage going, only I said a word that started with F and ended with K over and over and over again. Then I think I peed my body weight because we had the loo there. Like, I just, honestly, and then it's backwards as well. I end up with, it's basically 10 minutes to go before I can even put pen to paper. I am luckily going into this subject with a very high mark beforehand, but the subject is actually about managing processes. It turns out it's a really interesting subject, but there are two parts to the paper, right? One of them is about basically doing calculations to work out how quickly you can get things through a machine. And the other one is a critical analysis piece where you have to have an opinion. You've met me, right? Like, I've got an opinion on everything and I can write relatively well. So what would have been a smart thing to do, given they were worth 50% each and I had 15 minutes left to go? Smart thing would have been to write to my strengths, right? No, didn't do that. I actually did the maths. Yes. So we say the result was not good. And maybe this just shows my incredible ego when I say, you know, so it happens to the best of us. Be prepared for it to be a stressful experience. But also know that it's been written with you in mind. I know it's stressful, absolutely know it's stressful. And saying don't be stressed by it is like saying don't sneeze. At the end of the day, if I could choose, I wouldn't do it this way. If I had the resources, I would say, come in, talk to me for half an hour, I'll ask you some questions and work out what you think and what you know. And there'd be some of you that would freak out even more than doing a written exam, right? I get that, but at least I'd be able to keep testing you in a way that I personally don't think exams tell us anything more than whether you're good at exams or not. But the reality is that's what we have to do. The Priestley 11 guys are not looking like they're anywhere close to changing their minds on how we examine you. But look around you. You're all in the same boat. You started this together. You've ended up here together. And there are all sorts of people who have got through it. Some of them are complete idiots. Others of them are geniuses. There is not a High Court judge who hasn't sat a contract exam at some point. And there is not a dodgy dude like Dennis Danuto who also hasn't sat a contract law exam. There are plenty of you whose mothers and fathers managed to do it, and you know that they can't actually work out how to do the remote control on the TV. So, like, it's not something that you're not capable of doing. So, again, I think a little forewarned is better than forearmed. I don't mean to freak you out. What I say is, okay, acknowledge that it can be a scary thing. Some of you in the room will have done a few of them by now, and you'll be fine. But the more that you can get yourself familiar with what the process is, familiar with where you need to go, I do not think that it's daggy or overkill to have a practice run on getting out there by public transport at that same time of day if you haven't done that before, or working out how you're going to get there and making sure that you show up on time. Just making sure that you have what you need to do. There's plenty of science around doing exams, for example, that would suggest that if you're going to do practice exams, do one at the same time of day as this exam is going to be. If you want to do one to time, set at the same time. Do it in a room where the only thing that you have ideally is your desk and nothing else, and only have on that desk the things that you're allowed to have in the exam. Just the more practice and familiarity that you have, the more likely you are to do well. So, sorry.
One tip from me from last year is if you haven't got your student card yet, go and get it.
Oh.
It is a nightmare if you don't have it.
Yeah. Make sure you have your student card because they will check them and they won't let you in without them, and they're not easy. The people who run security, they really don't care whether you go to your exam or not. So they really do not care, and I'm pretty sure that it's not grounds for a deferred exam either if you can't get in.
You have to go up to this caravan and
Worst comes to worst, they do accept proof of student, like proof of being a student and your driver's license, though. They just have you sign a form.
So don't do that. Do that, worst comes to worst. Just have a bloody student card, right? Just turn up with the stuff that you need. You're an OUA, so your situation is even different. Sorry?
Don't get a student card, you've got to bring in photo ID.
So OUA students, well, we don't give you passes. You're not even allowed in the building, are you? I don't think. No, please don't. So read what the requirements are for your particular approach. So, for example, OUA students, I don't know why, but we just give them 5 minutes less reading time. I think of that as 5 minutes less time to panic, because you can't actually do anything in reading time other than read. So I try and make your exam a little bit shorter, just in case you're slow readers, but make sure in relation to your own stuff that you know exactly what it is you have to do, particularly if you haven't done it before. I know it seems a really ridiculous thing to say it out loud, but read the question. Be really clear. If there's only one thing that you're clear on when they ring that bell or blow the whistle or, I don't know, let off fireworks, whatever they do to let you get started, make sure you actually understand what the question is asking you. So at the beginning, at the end, always think, have I answered the question that was asked? I'm reliably informed that I write questions that have lots of irrelevant stuff in it, because part of the skill is working out what's relevant and what's not relevant. I know that's annoying to you. Sorry, my clients annoy me as well. So making sure you understand what the question is will help you identify what's relevant and what's not relevant. I know in responding to your written work, there are a number of people where I've said, and now I know you've only got one piece of feedback from me, substantial feedback for the first assignment, and I will be working very hard on the second assignment, and hopefully you'll have that in the middle of next week, would be my guess. Middle to end of next week is what I will be, well, I'll be aiming for the middle of next week, and hopefully I'll get it there by then. But I know a piece of feedback that I give quite often is IRAC is a great way of solving a problem. It's a pretty blunt instrument for structuring your writing in a more substantive piece. Works quite well for those little discussion board pieces that a number of you have done. Works brilliantly in exams. Okay, because what you're trying to do in an exam is be as strategic as you can. You need to demonstrate to me that you can answer the question, you know what's relevant, you can do the things that are in IRAC. You can identify what the issue is, you can identify what the relevant law is, you can think about how that law might be applied, and you can come up with a tentative conclusion of some sort. And it's actually not a problem to structure it out that way. Remember it. Look around the room at how many people are here. There is another person for every person that's in this room, and we are under pressure to mark these things as quickly as we can. We don't have the luxury of them being typed out, so we have to negotiate your handwriting, and particularly the OUA ones turn up at all sorts of times. We have no idea when they're coming, so we're already cranky when we start. Don't make us cranky. Make it as easy as possible for us to see the good work that you've done. Now, I don't want to worry you. We look for the good work that you've done, right? You know, I want you guys to do well. It makes me look good. The ones who don't do well, I have to put up with you again next semester. It's like, you know, I want you to pass, right? I really want you to, in fact, I want you to do really well. I want to be going around at what we call the course assessment committee meetings and say, look how well these guys did. Because it makes me look like a good teacher, right? So I want that to happen. But at the end of the day, I can only do it if you do the work. So the easier you present the work so I can find it, the better. So again, in an exam, IRAC can be a really good way of structuring, or at least doing some working out. I would suggest that an exam is the one and only place where you can forget about the trees. I think it even says to write on both sides of the paper, particularly if you think you need to do some working out, you know, that you might want to, you know, draw a flowchart or write down issues and whatever on one. Use one side of the piece of paper, make it clear it's your working out. Tell me if you want me to look at it. Tell me if you want me to ignore it, and I can do that. Particularly if you have really messy handwriting too, feel free to write on every second line, because just make it easier for me to read it. don't feel like you have to cram it all into one book. There's no shortage of books. They will not run out, and nobody will know that it was you, I promise. Critical analysis. The most important thing in the critical analysis piece is I want to know what your point of view is. So your point of view needs to demonstrate that you know a little bit about the area of law and you can recognise the cases. It won't be enough in a critical analysis piece to just identify, oh, okay, this question is asking me about privity, so going and skim reading the chapter about privity and putting 4 points from the textbook, that just shows me that you can use an index and the chapter table of contents in the textbook. To be able to actually talk about what the issue is or what the problem is, why it matters and what you think, and then illustrate what you think with cases is really what we're looking for there. So it's your critique, your analysis of a particular area of law. Always cite a source. If you make a statement about what the law is, include a citation. Now, a citation, a case name is enough. I do not need a full string citation or anything like that, just the name. If you happen to have a highlighter with you, run a highlighter through it or something so that they stand out, okay? Some people go to the trouble of changing coloured pens to make them stand out. That works nicely as well. I don't know why, I just feel like that's time wasting, that you can write them all and when you finish the question, when you're going back to just check everything, just get your highlighter out or underline. I don't care, it doesn't need to be pretty, just highlight the cases that you've used. If it's a case that I think, so Great Britain, the Royal Pharmaceutical Society of Great Britain and Boots Cash Chemists, Boots would be fine. That's a lot of words to write and I just need to know that you can support something. Carlile and carbolic smoke ball, Carlile, smoke ball, either of those things will work, particularly after the first time. I'm not testing you on how quickly you can write out long case names. What I'm asking you to do is demonstrate to me that you know which cases support the things that you're saying. So if you can do that in a sensible way, then you should do that. Stick to contract law. Sorry, I'm not sticking to the order of my bullet points. How unusual. Stick to contract law. If it turns out that, just say the second assignment question that all of you have worked on or are working on now, depending on where you're up to, there were possibilities there for, with those facts, for there to be potentially a question about family law, which would be lovely, but that would not answer the question. Talking at length about family law. Now, it might be if you had that question in, you might have a throwaway line that demonstrates you're thinking like a lawyer and saying, I'd probably get one of the family law partners to talk about it or have a look, something like that. Fine, great, but just don't waste time on it. Stick to contract law and stick to the subject matter of this course. So for example, so we don't actually talk about in this course grounds for termination. We will occasionally talk about whether you can terminate a contract or not in the context of, is there a contract that can be terminated? It is perfectly okay for you not to address grounds for termination. If a question is mentioning termination or a party asks, can it be terminated? You think about this course, right? Your job is to work out, well, in order for a contract to be terminated, we need a contract in the first place. I'm not going to talk about the termination point. I'm going to talk about whether there's a contract or not. Make sense? Yes, some of you, and I mean the doctors in particular, the people who should have done medicine based on your handwriting instead of law, and I know it's a stereotype, but I'm pick on my doctors, write every second line, okay? Make it, I will not just assume that because your handwriting is awful that you are smart. And, you know, unless you give me a medical certificate, slip it in there to absolve me from actually marking your exam. No, I actually said that out loud. Please don't do that. Okay, things to avoid. Every single exam that I get will come with a copy of the exam with it. I do not need you to write out the question again, okay? I know what the question is. This is unlike the kind of formative writing you do in the main assessment tasks. Your job here is to answer the question, not reproduce it. Don't summarise the facts. However, if there is I started to read one point and I'm going off track. In relation to the question and the facts that are presented, I only want you to tell me about facts in the scenario if you need to make an assumption or if you need to highlight a specific thing. So for example, say the problem related to the sale of a puffball that was designed to stop you getting tinea. And the facts were otherwise very similar to Carl Hill and carbolic smoke ball, except that there was no mention of putting money in the bank to show sincerity. You might actually want to highlight that fact, that there's a difference between Carl Hill and this scenario because there was no mention of money being put in the bank, and you might distinguish based on those facts. You might decide that they're not relevant. You just might want to point it out and say, well, that's a significant difference, but it will depend on the scenario. So point out facts if they're relevant. If you are talking about a case, state what the case stands for and tell me what the case is. You don't need to explain what happened in the case. You don't need to reproduce it in any way. But just be clear whether you think the case supports your argument or whether you would be using it, be distinguishing it in some way. So again, let me give you an example. When we talked about intention in commercial relationships, we talked about two cases with really similar scenarios. So the Malaysian Metals and Kleinwort-Benson case and the A&I case, both decided around the time, very, very similar facts, slightly different wording. You might actually use those cases in support of a particular scenario, a particular answer that you're giving, but you might need to point out how very similar facts ended up with different results, point to the wording in the letter, something like that. Also, don't miss any questions, even if that means that a question that you're halfway through isn't going to be perfect. I'm regularly told not to say this, but in my life it has always been true that the distance between 49% and 50 is way, way, way smaller than the difference between 79 and 80. It's actually impossible to give you any marks if you don't do any work, right? So if you don't answer the question, you are going to get 0. So if you've got something in there, even if they're just bullets, even if it's just a start, I've got something to give you. And most people, even with really something quite scrappy in an exam, will be able to get somewhere between 40 and 55. It's really quite, so percent, I mean, in relation to that particular question. It can be really hard though to jump from being in the 70s at a distinction answer into a high distinction answer. And when you look at what the criteria for marking are and how you really need to distinguish yourself from everybody else in order to get a distinction, and then you need to really highly distinguish yourself in order to get a high distinction, and the distinction mark starts at 8 out of 10, right? It's at 80. It's actually relative, that pushes the pressure down in relation to the marking criteria at that end. But you can do something that's going to get you 8 out of 10 or 79 out of 100 because you've really pushed yourself, but then you get 0 if you don't do the question that you missed because you were really pushing to do that other one. So just make sure that you answer the questions because you can come back. And like I said, I'm very comfortable with bullet pointing. By the way, these are tips for doing this exam in this subject. Other teachers might come up with something completely different and you need to listen to them in relation to their own. If you make an assumption that you're aware that you've made, that is, please make a note of it, let me know. So occasionally there are errors and typos in exams. We proofread them over and over again, 15 people read them. But I know there was one in last semester's exam. Clearly I'd changed the gender of somebody along the way. And so it said him, and then it said her, and then it said him again. So a couple of people quite helpfully noted that this particular character in my question clearly didn't identify on the cis spectrum, which was fine. But at least they're saying, I think it's the same person the whole way through. But if somebody had decided that this was a second person based on this typo, if I know that, I can mark them on that basis, right? I can get the question right in my head. Also, often assumptions demonstrate how you're thinking about the problem, and that helps me understand what it is that you're doing. And then if you can avoid it, please don't panic. Please don't panic. Think of that and just don't panic. Okay, oh, sorry, went that way. All right. Sorry, before I go on, questions, concerns, frustrations? Who's excited, looking forward to it? Oh, Peter, you.
Not excited, just a question. Excited for it to be over.
I'm excited for it to be over too.
Are you happy with dot points all the way through, or is that just assuming that we get to the end and we're running out of time?
I'm happy with dot points all the way through. This is about quality, not quantity. You only have 2 hours. So don't write a word that doesn't count, would be my point of view. Think about the structure and the order that you present things, because they do, just random dot points of awesomeness. I can see that you know what you're doing, but I can't necessarily see how it's going to fall put together. So think about your structure and your order. Feel free, by the way, to just, put your points down and then, number them in the order you want me to read them or something like that. This is not, you're not being rewarded for your English writing prose ability here. You're being rewarded for content, answering the question, doing it in a sensible way. Yeah? So, short essay, critical responses. Those people, and there aren't many of them in the face-to-face group, but those people who have done a few of these in the discussion group area are pretty good at these now. That basically what we're looking for here is a range of these kind of things. So it might not all, the focus could be different, the emphasis might be on a different syllable somewhere along the way. So they're questions about why the law works the way that it does, or why there are exceptions, or why there might be a legislative overlay, or what do we learn from exceptions? What issues might there be? Now, I do my level best to raise these things as we go in the classes, and there are a couple of things that will stand out. Some things that just kind of make sense. There's often questions about privity. I'm not saying that there is a question about privity this time, but you will see in the previous exams there have been, partly because the whole chapter in the textbook about privity is about should we still have privity or not? Does it really make a difference? So that's actually kind of an easy one to do. We have talked only last week about unfair contract terms. and the existence of a legislative overlay, and I sent you a news report about a very current version of why that legislation might be useful and why the laws in relation to intention might not be as relevant now or as useful now as they used to be. Again, with each of the subjects, each of the topics, it's worthwhile just stopping for a minute and thinking, why do we need this? Why is this a formation element? And I know we do it at the very beginning, but there is real value in going, and we don't really talk about it because you don't know anything about contracts at that stage, but there's a really good good benefit in going back and reading chapters 1 and 2 of your textbook again and thinking about, why do we have contract law at all? And does this, we keep coming back to this idea of a private law, this idea and differentiating between a private and a public law, but think about it and come up to your own view as to whether each of the topics actually achieve that outcome. And is that the right outcome now? I think the best way to study for the critical analysis piece is to just keep asking yourself those questions when you're reviewing each of the topics and you're thinking about how you might use them to solve problems. So, critical analysis. If I read your answer and at the end of it I've got no idea what you think about the issue, then you haven't answered the question. So I want you to try and answer the question. For some people, and it's really helpful when you do this, it depends on how the question is phrased, of course, but to actually say, I think this is good, or no, this is a terrible idea, or Justice Kirby's outline in Woolworths as to why we have consideration is useful for these reasons, but bad for those reasons, or whatever it is that you think. It's really good if you can make it clear what your point of view is and then support your point of view with illustrations from the cases or from the textbook. Cases beat text usually, so think of them as primary and secondary sources. If you can use primary data, that's got more academic credibility than secondary data. Secondary data is just what other people think about it. I'm interested in what you think. Secondary data will help your opinion, especially if you're lucky enough to disagree with somebody who's peer reviewed and you've got a good reason for doing so. That makes you seem really smart. This is why academics are such a cranky bunch, because they're all just trying to prove they're smart by disagreeing with each other all the time. This is why, as a practitioner, I feel so much happier. But if you've got an opinion and you can show that that opinion is supported by academic writing as well, that is also a good thing. It only adds credibility, and particularly because, you know, I've read the textbooks more times than you. If you are copying something out of the textbook and you don't tell me it comes from the textbook, chances are I'll pick it up because, you know, I knew about the question in advance. So you have more credibility if you talk about it. You have more credibility again if it's your own opinion. Could be a good idea for each topic to make a note or a list of areas for reform or questions or ideas that you think might be interesting if it turns out the critical analysis question is about that topic. By the way, does not hurt at all, particularly when you look at the high distinction criteria. If you're answering a problem about an area of the law and you pop in a line or two that shows that you are aware of law reform in that area, or that you think there should be law reform in that particular area, or that you have seen something that you have an opinion about. So if you look at what the criteria are for high distinctions, it requires synthesis, and it's very hard to demonstrate synthesis if you don't have an opinion on something. Demonstrate that you can link your opinion to the case law, Or, even better, clearly demonstrate that your opinion is formed from your synthesis of the cases and their potential application in a modern Australian context. So it's a good thing for you to think about situations where you might enter into a contract, or where you see contracts happening around you, or where you think that there might be a potential for a contract dispute. Bringing in real world examples is as credible, particularly in these kind of questions, in the critical analysis questions, as bringing in the cases. Problem solving. Use ORAC, we've talked about that already. Work out early, who are you acting for? So are you being asked to just come to a view about who is on the side of right, or have you been asked to advise Fred or Jack or Jill? If you are advising somebody, make sure you know what question they've asked. And don't be afraid, particularly if it's a character in a scenario, if they've asked the wrong question, to politely tell them so, to explain what it is that they need to know. So again, example I used before, if the question is from the client, can I terminate the contract? You are most likely going to, well, before we can work out whether you can terminate, we need to know whether there is a contract. And termination is not one of the topics for this course, so don't suddenly be reading the termination chapter in your textbook. The exam room is the last place that you want to read anything in that textbook or casebook for the first time. Assume that fact scenarios are now, unless they specifically give you dates. Assume it's now, and that the law up to the day of the exam is the law that you are writing on. It's always worth thinking about whether the Australian consumer law or some other legislation might apply, but if the question says advise on the common law, point out that the common law might not be the whole of the story, but advise how the common law would work. Read carefully. Make sure that you're responding to the issues that you have been asked about, and a little bit about all of the relevant issues will beat a deep dive on an irrelevant issue in most cases, or on only every one or two. And a little bit will beat nothing by a huge proportion, okay? The way that this exam is set up, there are longer and shorter questions about the scenario. So they're trying to help you focus in on relevant parts of the scenario. So the scenarios will help you get some sense of context, and they basically will act as it will act as an anchor to work with. Sometimes, even though there's a scenario there, the question still might ask you to talk more generally about a particular area of the law. So to explain a legal term or a concept, or even to talk about the key point in a case. The scenario in particular, these will ask you to look at the facts from alternative points of view. So you might actually need to start thinking about one party and then start thinking about another, particularly as the facts might change, in the sense that you'll get a scenario and then one of the questions will say, well, if X, Y, Z didn't happen, would your answer be different? Or if this happened next, would your answer be different? So I'm going to go through some example questions. You've got some past exams. I know it is a matter of frustration for you that you've got past exams but you don't have answers to them. That's a difficulty that I can't really get over at the moment. I am not actually prepared to mark your practice exams either, but I am very happy to have a phone call with you about a specific question that you have. I think you need to do them. I also think there is value in you doing them together and swapping them, or workshopping the answers, because you already know what you know and you can think. You can add something to somebody else's conversation and thinking, and they can add something to yours. But I just do not have the capacity to pre-mark exams. We just don't have the resources for that. Some practice questions. I forgot this slide was still here. So, a few more practice questions for you actually. So this would be, the first couple would be quite standard critical analysis questions. So might ask you to compare or contrast two cases. So the first one there is to talk about the differences between Oscar Chess and Dick Bentley and JJ Savage. What have they got in common? How are they different from each other? The one I mentioned before could work in a similar way, MMC and the ANI case, for example. Also, it's quite usual to have cases where they set up a test and look at what the two tests might be. So Cadelpha as opposed to BP Refinery might be a way of doing that. By the way, these are examples, so the chances of exactly that question being on the paper are very slim, but hey, you never know. We are very lazy. I am anyway. Considering exceptions and when they might apply, here's a couple of examples of questions there. When can a person who's not privy to a contract enforce any rights that they have under the contract? One of the ones last semester was, can you enforce somebody's promise to give a gift? Another one that I've seen, when might you use a novation? So they're sort of short questions with, to have some critical analysis, they probably need a little bit more in them, but not much. And potential areas for law reform. So come back and have a look. I will put this up straight after the class. Don't panic. Okay? That's all you have to do is just not panic. Get on with it and be awesome. That's all I have to say about the exam, unless you have more questions. Unless we want to stop and watch an episode of How I Met Your Mother, which I can do at just about any time. Okay, questions, concerns, frustrations?